Syunik is the southernmost province in the Republic of Armenia. It's a beautiful and mountainous region with great strategic importance. The latter is probably why you've been hearing about Syunik recently. If you've been following the news on what's been happening back in Armenia since the ceasefire with Azerbaijan back in November over Artsakh. During the attack on Artsakh last fall, we produced a short series related to Artsakh. One of the episodes was The Story of Artsakh, where our resident historian and good friend, Chris J. Khachadour, took us through our people's history in that particular region. So we would like to do that again, periodically throughout the show to spend some time highlighting the history of a particular Armenian region, today's being Syunik. You are listening to Haituk Talks, the official podcast of the AYF West. I'm Haik Minasyan.
A cousin of Armenians talking in the world.
Welcome, Chris. Thanks for coming back. I'm super excited to have you here. I love having these history combos with you. Welcome back, man.
Hey, I good to be back.
So in our Artsakh series, you and I did the story of Artsakh, where we went through the millennia over a particular historical Armenian region's history. And I'd really like to do these over time, like different regions throughout Armenia. But with everything going on in Syunik today, I think Syunik is very appropriate to talk about. To kind of like catch us up in Syunik, in the last month, we've been hearing about how Azerbaijani troops have been kind of encroaching and coming on the Armenian side of the border, been harassing the Armenian population there. They are really putting pressure on Armenia to create this corridor. So Syunik has become like this, it's been in the news a lot recently. And I think it'd be very important for us to discuss and talk about the history of the region of Syunik. I love Syunik. I went back in 2018 with my birthright group. We stayed in Mehri for a night. It was beautiful. It's like a completely different climate zone almost, a little warmer. Like all the pomegranates really grow out there. The Arkaya narinches, the persimmons. There's a lot of persimmons down there. Really beautiful part of Armenia. You've been there too.
Yeah,
right?
Also with birthright.
Right. Mehri.
Yeah.
But I think, and so you like stopped by a few different like sites and landmarks over there.
Yeah.
I think my favorite was the Zorats Karer or Karahunj. And I think you know what it is, but Karahunj is, they call it the Armenian Stonehenge, and it's kind of debated what it exactly is. It's thousands of years older than the European British Stonehenge, like 7,000 BC. Who knows? They don't exactly know when, but it's this debate whether it's an archaeoastronomical site. What that means is it might have something to do with the stars and the sun and the moon, or it's a ritual space. But it's really cool because you go there and they're geometrically aligned, and there's these little holes in all these rocks that they believe either are ways to like look at the different stars at night, or but the name Karahunj means Kar, which is rock, and Hunj is sound. And so the story goes is like through these holes, like the wind kind of makes noise through them and stuff. So that was my favorite. Did you have a favorite landmark in Syunik that you really liked when you went?
I mean, I really liked Kapan as a town.
Mm-hmm.
It's really pretty. It's like in a deep canyon along the Volodon River, and then there's like a tomb memorial for Garagin Nejde.
Oh, right. I love that spot.
Also, and it's the foot of Mount Khostub.
Yeah, with the mountain in the background.
Yeah.
It's actually really, really beautiful.
And then
down
in
there.
the middle of the city, there's actually a statue of David Bek on his horse.
Didn't they say didn't Karagin Nejde say he wanted to be buried on that mountain or something up there?
Yeah, so it's like a tomb memorial type thing. He's not buried there, but.
And Goris, which is one of these other cities that is over there, was also very beautiful.
Really
like very cool rocks and stuff. And fun fact, before we get into the rest of the history, you guys, during World War II, a lot of the German prisoners of war were actually stationed or put in a camp near Goris and were instrumental in creating the infrastructure of that city. So if you notice how squared and how organized it is, you could thank the Germans for that one. I even met people in Syunik. In Mehri, we had like these German, non-Armenian people with us, and these Armenians there actually took German classes back in the Soviet Union. They were able to speak German with these German guys, so it was very cool. But Karahunj is like almost Armenian prehistory, Armenian ancient pagan history, and then we get into ancient Armenian kingdoms, which from Urartu's period. 800 BC to all the way up until after the Persians took us over. Let's say the first Armenian kingdom started around 300-400 BC, you'd say, right?
Yeah.
And Syunik was an integral province. But the name Syunik, and for a short while, I wasn't sure what the name Sunni came from. It sounded like Sunni Islam for a second, but I remember looking it up, and it was actually the name of a family, correct?
It's a bit complicated. We don't know exactly where Syunik originates from. There's a few theories. One theory is that it's from Urartian god Shivini, so Syuni.
It sounds similar, yeah.
Yeah, that's one theory. Another theory is that it's actually from Sisak. Sisak was a descendant of Haik, the legendary patriarch of Armenians.
Me?
Yeah, close enough. And his grandfather Geram settled along the Gerama Mountains between Yerevan and Lake Sevan. Gerargunik is also related to the Geram.
And if you notice, all of them have the k at the end, right? I think we mentioned this in the Artsakh episode, how k means plural. The many Sunnis, let's say, many.
Yeah. So Sisak was said to be the ancestor of this family, the Sunnis. So Syunik means the land of the Sunni. So other Armenian noble families like the Rushtuni, they had their own province called Rushtunik. So it's a similar trend across the highlands.
The highs were from hike. It's you see this suffix in a lot of Armenian names and place names, and the Sunni family, from what we understand, was the noble family of that region during the ancient Armenian kingdoms, right? During Tigran Mez's time, during the Ardashesian and Arshaguni kingdoms.
They've been the main family there for over 1,000 years.
That's crazy. And so that's why it's synonymous with the region, the name Syunik, and till this day. But the Sunni family, I mean, when did they get out of power? Were they around how long?
Well, it depends. So the Sunnis, they kind of branched out to smaller families after their state collapse in 1170.
Okay.
But there's a long history up to that region.
Oh my God.
That time of history.
So for 1,000 years, this family was kind of in charge in that region.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not much else known. I guess it's hard to tell, but how do we know for sure that Syunik was a part of this Armenian kingdom?
So we know that Syunik was a part of Armenia because there is a stone from the 2nd century BC that King Artashes had left behind, saying that here is the border of Armenia. And it was south of Lake Sevan. So the Lake Sevan area, Gerargunik, and modern-day Faodstor were all part of Syunik, as well as the Khachadour region of Artsakh, which is now part of Azerbaijan.
Western Artsakh, we could say.
Yeah.
So this rock, which has lasted throughout time, kind of like what states the different provinces that were part of that border area, you could say.
It kind of says here is the border. It's a border stone. It's used across the world, even in the Roman times.
Right.
And it was written in Aramaic.
Oh.
That was the language of Imperial Persia.
That was the major language of the time, right? So, there's rock proof of the Syunik being part of an integral part of the Armenian kingdom at that time. And so throughout the centuries, and we're not going to get too into depth here. So throughout those centuries, Armenians were ruling that region. Christianity comes to the region. We have, Surp Hovannes, which is like a 6th or 7th century AD, like a monastery or church there. It's a monastery. And near Sisian, which is where that Soratskhared are, the Armenian Stonehenge. But like you said earlier, you went and visited Baghaberd, which was one of those castles of that time period, right?
Yeah, Baghaberd has its origins in the 4th century, I believe. It's one of the larger fortresses in the region and was the last stronghold of the Sunnis when the Seljuks came in 1170.
So it lasted up until then, huh? Like the entire 500-600 years there. That's crazy.
There's another one, I believe it's called Sambataberd. It's nowadays in Vaotstor, but again, Vaotstor was historically part of
Syunik's region. Right. Some guy Sambat must have built it, huh?
Yeah.
Sambat.
That's also from the 5th century, and again, until the Turks came.
It was being used and still being
I mean, even after the Turks left, it was renovated, and then it was demolished by the Mongols.
Well, real fast, and I always think about this because there's a lot of other countries that can they still have royal blood within the population in the sense that there's still noble families that they can attest their families coming from. It's hard for Armenians because for the most part they wiped out our nobility, right? Like throughout the centuries.
That was like a political tool constantly. I mean, the first major step was by the Arabs in 705. They burned 800 noblemen alive in a church in Khachadour.
Yeah. I mean, also the Byzantines would then go and move a lot of these noble families away from the border regions because they
The
saw them.
Arzunis were moved to Sebastian, they Sivas. The Bagradunis were forcibly removed from Ani to Tomarza near Kayseri or Gesaria.
Away from the border regions. So a lot of these noble families, like the Sunnis, if anything, the Sunnis are one of those unique cases where they were able to last a little longer. But a lot of these families, they died out or they were forced out, and we see the end of the Armenian kingdoms around the 11th century, correct? With the Bagradunis and the Ani, the capital city. Was Sunni part of the Bagratid Armenia?
So the kingdom of Syunik appears around the same time as the Bagradunis.
So it's a separate kingdom.
Distinct, but somewhat of a vassal. Like they intermarried.
Right. They're connected.
This kingdom of Syunik was definitely closer to the kingdom of Armenia, centered on Ani, than, let's say, Vaspuragan. They were a lot more antagonistic towards each other.
Right.
I believe Princess Mariam Syuni had married one of the Bagraduni kings.
Makes sense.
So they were a lot closer and they worked together. And even the families of Artsakh, a lot of them originate from the Sisakan family, the Sunnis.
Got their nobility or their legitimacy from the Sunni dynasty, maybe.
Yeah, because that was the eastward expansion.
Right.
Way, before Christ.
Yeah.
The one figure we know of is Vasak Syuni, who was like the
right.
the black sheep of Armenian history.
You're right.
No one talks about him anymore,
Well, no one names their kids Vasak anymore.
Yeah.
So for context, Vasak Syuni was the guy that fought with Vartan Mamigonyan
Against.
He was going to fight with him and switched sides to the Iran, the Sasanian side. So the original Benedict Arnold, or whatever you want to call it, of Armenian history. So you're right. His last name was Sunni.
Vasak Syuni.
And you do see the name Sunni. I know there's an Armenian historian with the last name Sunni as well, up in New York as well. So you do see those names. I don't know if they have a connection to those families, but
that family's from Artsakh, so most likely
there could be.
Yeah,
100%. So medieval era, we have a new renaissance in Armenia, and you'll see this theme or this renaissance throughout the different Armenian regions when we talk about Armenian history. When we go to these other regions, there was a medieval renaissance where Armenians were building dozens of monasteries and churches and complexes and thousands of books. And I think the most famous landmark or monument heritage site in Syunik is the Datev Monastery. I mean, I don't know if it's the most famous, but in the recent years, once they've made that tramway, it's become one of those top sites to go visit for tourists. And it's beautiful and it's still very much intact. It's on top of a cliff. And correct me if I'm wrong. Was it the Mongols? Who was it that went there and burned all the books?
It was the Seljuks in 1170, which marked the end of the kingdom of Syunik. So they burnt down 10,000 manuscripts at Datev, destroyed Baghabert fortress, and laid waste to the land.
Not only am I going to kill you all, I'm going to destroy your history. I wonder where I've heard that one before. I'm going to wipe out all your books so that no one remembers you. They do that threat once in a while, Or no one will remember who you ever were.
Yeah.
But here we are. 1,000 years later.
But here's the thing, though. The Seljuks did that, and that was 1170. But by 1211, not even 50 years later, the Zakarians, these generals of Armenian origin, serving in a Georgian army, liberated Syunik and installed the Orbelian family.
Orbelians.
And
I've heard of them.
The Orbelians are famous for building these large monasteries in Syunik, Vayotsord. So they built Noravank, they renovated Datev, as you mentioned. And fun fact about Datev is that it was actually home to one of the oldest universities in Armenia.
Right, I've heard of that too. That's what they told us there.
So the original university is in Khachadour, which is in Vayotsor. So historically, again, Syunik.
Yeah.
And that was established in 1280 by a man from Mush, Nerses Mashetsi, in 1280. And it was there until 1340, moving then to Datev. And it was in Datev until 1434, when it was kind of ransacked by Shah Rukh, who was a descendant of Tamerlane.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, from 1280 to 1434, so for about 150 years.
So the family that followed the Sunnis was the Orbelians, or the Zakarians put in.
Well, the Zakarians installed the Orbelians.
The Orbelians, but what happened to the Orbelians? Do we kind of know, or what happened to them?
So they're kind of still around. A lot of them, again, so we mentioned how they kind of disappeared, or their dominion collapsed in the 15th century because of the Tamerlane's invasions and the Karakoyunlu and Akkoyunlu Turkic tribal confederations that laid waste and made Armenia into a desert. A lot of the Orbelians moved to Georgia. There's a theory that they're actually from Georgia, from a place called Orbeti, and then they moved back.
That would make sense.
I mean, the presidential palace,
least, yeah.
the presidential palace of the Georgian president is called Orbeliani Palace. So there's theories. It's kind of like the whole Balkradoni, Balkrationi thing.
Yeah.
So they've swayed both sides, Armenia and Georgia.
That's usually how those noble families worked anyway.
Yeah.
And those, these parts of Armenia were almost probably more connected to the Caucasus rather than like Western Armenia all the way near Giligay, at the end of the day, just geographically closer. So I remember thinking or seeing that there was, Orbelian manors in Artsakh too, like where these families still had their, I don't know if they were still lords in a way, but, they still had, the Orbelian family did continue. And you're saying they're still around today? Or,
yeah, there's like famous Armenians with the last name Orbelian, like Constantine Orbelian. And they were like doctors and writers in the Soviet era who had the last name Orbelian or Orbeli.
Yeah.
But yeah, even though the Orbelians collapsed in the 15th century, by that point, the Armenian Catholicos had already returned to Echmiadzin in 1441. So there was already a reawakening of Armenian identity and political establishments in the region. And you saw the rise of these meliks. We mentioned them in the Artsakh episode. Mm-hmm. Melik is an Arabic term meaning king, but it was more of a princely, noble title, like a lord.
Yeah.
They were also called Danoder in Armenian, or like Dander. We still use as landlord.
Yeah.
They were lords who owned the local land and collected taxes and imposed their own laws. So Syunik had a few melikdoms, if you will, or principalities, small entities.
And was Syunik under the Iranians at this point, Persian Empire? Which empire was it around?
So when the Karakoyunlu and Akkoyunlu and those Turkic tribes came, they were there from like the 1300s when the Mongol Ilkhanate collapsed until 1501, when the Safavids kind of re-emerged as this Iranian superpower. And the Safavids held the region until 1722 when the Afghans invaded Iran and the Safavid dynasty was on the verge of collapse.
Well, could you name, I think we were talking before this, that there were a few notable Armenians from this region, and we're about to get into this early Armenian independence movement in the 1700s that kind of started in this Syunik region, but these guys seem like the predecessors.
Yeah, so one of the main figures we have is Israel Ori. He was born in Sisyan, and again, he was from the Melik family, he's from the Melik Haigazians. And he was instrumental in kind of trying to gain international support in Russia, Germany, even Britain, to kind of help liberate Armenia, send some support to these long-lost Christians.
Well, because this whole region, whether it was Nakhichevan or Syunik, they were, famous merchants and traders, like, moving product from like Asia to Europe, and they were on these merchant ships working with the Europeans. I'm sure some of them were wealthy to the point where they were like, hey, look, it's we're second class citizens. They dreamt of an independent Armenia.
So I mean, while Israel Ori was Syunik born and raised, another figure that kind of came right after him is called Hofsep Emin or Joseph Emin. He was born in Iran and then raised in India. But again, his family is originally from Nakhichevan. And he was, again, instrumental in going to London and elsewhere and trying to gain international support for these Armenians. Another famous figure we have is Shahamir Shahamedian. Again, Iran-born to a family of expelled Armenians, moved to India, and even him and his son both have written testimony saying they want to see this independent Armenia.
Didn't one of them write a constitution or like a very short
so
constitution?
Shahamir Shahamedian, Vorogait Parats is the book he wrote. It was the constitution for Armenia.
It's one of the earliest like liberal constitutions I've ever heard of, because it's saying stuff like all the people of the land of Armenia will be treated equally, Armenian or not Armenian, in a free country. And it's actually unprecedented how it's one of the earliest like statements to a independent Armenia and a like non-monarchic it sounds like republic,
It was published in 1773, and Article 3 of it said, and I quote, "Every human being, whether Armenian or of some other race, whether man or woman, born in Armenia or brought there from another country, shall live in equality and shall be free in all their occupations. Nobody shall have the right to enslave another person, and workers should be paid like in any other kind of job, as is laid down in Armenian legislation.
What year was this again?
1773.
So like early Enlightenment, I guess, huh?
The funny thing is, it predates the U.S. Constitution,
Right.
which is like the model constitution for the world.
I know, and especially for our part of the world, I feel like this is pretty cool, like unprecedented, and
Yeah.
Some Armenian guy from India at this point writing these
He
things.
is writing in India at this point, in Madras.
And I love what it says on his grave.
His son's grave.
Or his son's grave.
Jacob.
What does it say?
I don't have the direct quote, but it basically says, I wish I saw the day where someone rose among our ranks worthy enough to liberate our homeland.
Right. And he knew he was maybe too early for his time, but
He died like at 29. He was pretty young when he died.
what years? And this was still the end of the 1700s?
He died in 1770 something.
Well, so he must have known about David Beck.
Yeah.
Right. Like he probably is thinking about that era. And this is one of my like favorite parts of Armenian history that not a lot of people know about is the David Beck story. Who is David Beck? So in the early 1700s, the Safavid Empire
Safavids who ruled there were
collapsing.
1722. The Afghans invaded, and the Ottomans were like,
Time to take advantage of the fact that they're weak and they're distracted and they're disorganized. Let's try to land grab. And the locals of the Caucasus, the Armenians, and necessarily, let's say, all the groups were kind of fighting for their own chance at independence at the same time. And I love telling the story, so I'll kind of jump into it. Is these Armenians, we have to fight to survive because we're going to either be conquered by a new master who is unpredictable, right? And so they requested assistance from the king of Georgia, or was it Kakheti at this time? The kingdom of Kakheti?
it was Kartli.
Kartli, right? Kingdom of Kartli. So the Georgian king, who was probably the closest Christian ruler at that time for the Armenians, they asked for assistance. And what he did is he sent them an Armenian general, David Beck, who is from Syunik.
He's a local, yeah.
And there's a town called David Beck today, right?
It's a village.
It's a village.
It was actually bombed during the recent war.
Yeah, there was a bomb that fell. Yeah.
2 civilians were killed there.
Yeah, it's right on the border with Artsakh, and so David Beck, originally from Syunik, I guess maybe he was up in Georgia at this time fighting with the Georgians, but this is what the Georgians did: is they said, "Hey, David Beck, here's a few thousand troops. Take them, 2,000 troops. Go down to Syunik and help them out." Right, and even though they were outnumbered at this point, David Beck became a legend, almost like Vartan Mami Gyonyan or Hagnabit or Medzin Dikran or Garigin Nejda, where he fought off armies that were 10 times larger than his and had many successes and became a legendary hero.
Yeah.
He did die. So the famous battle at this point was the Battle of Halidzor. And I do want to tell the story because it's got a 300 kind of vibe, the Spartan story of 300 soldiers fighting. So what happened was David Beck and his troops fought off the Iranian advance. The Persians were trying to retake the Caucasus, but they were unsuccessful. And then the Ottomans were on their way with a huge army of like 70,000 people, 70,000 soldiers, more like Turkish troops than there was actually Turks in the region, right?
And Armenians too at that point in Syunik.
Yeah, 70,000 was more than anything, and I'm surprised they were even able to like keep them fed at that point. It was such a large army, but so the Armenians, David Beck, they're held up in the castle or the
fortress.
The fortress of Halidzor, with their people inside. 7 days in, they're getting hungry, and Mkhitar Sparabet, he's the number 2, basically, his right-hand man, David Beck's right-hand man, he says, he has a speech where he's like, it's better that we go die with courage outside rather than stay inside and watch our loved ones, perish in front of our eyes. And they stormed this 70,000, large army head on with like these 300 guys. And the story goes is where they were so surprised or confused at the fact that this smaller trapped army was just rushing them that they thought there had to be some sort of trick or some sort of a strategy to it. And so the army panicked and they started to retreat. And during that retreat, they, stepped on each other and killed, trampled each other to death. And the Armenians killed like 12,000 of them. And supposedly, our casualties were very low. And it's one of those famous 300 like stories that, that we have from that era. And so David Beck at that point was ingrained as a legendary hero. But I believe a year later, he died.
He died, 1728.
1728, and they say either it was he was poisoned or he just got sick. He died. Mkhitar Sparabed number 2. he takes over, right? He's still trying to keep this movement going, because at this point, Armenia, these like 5-6 years where they're fighting off let's say the new conquerors, they're semi-independent. There's hopes that potentially there'll be some sort of autonomous state, but he was still having difficulty creating that hope or sense of like possibility in the local population. So he's and the Turks are coming back. The Ottomans are coming back for round 2 because the legendary hero died and they want their revenge. And so Mkhitar Sparabet's trying to organize the army, create their defenses. And in the town of Khunzoresk, which is in Syunik, and Khunzoresk is actually a pretty cool town to go to because they have these mountain cave dwellings. You'll see these actually throughout Armenia, where at one point Armenians would go and settle in like cliff sides because it was a safe place to hide, or like stay safe, hard to reach, let's say. So he was trying to create this defensive fortress at this in Khunzoresk, but the Khunzoresks didn't see any hope. They didn't think that they could win out against the invading army, and so they stabbed Mkhitar Sparabet in the back, severed his head and offered his head to the Pasha, the Ottoman commander, and said, "Look, we don't want any trouble. Here's our rebellious leader's head. Please don't hurt us." But I really like, unfortunately, the impression that this Pasha had of these Armenians was, how can I trust you as my subjects if you're willing to betray your own people like this at your one chance at freedom, So I think one of the themes that comes with this story of David Bek is like, you need to unite or you will die. You will not succeed unless you're all on the same page together. And so the David Bek story, I mean, they made a film during the Soviet Union. It's became this legendary story up until today. And this was the early 1700s, so 1722. And for me personally, because I like Armenian history a lot, I didn't know that anything like this was happening during the American Revolution, or like those periods.
At the same time,
yeah, that we were writing a constitution for a free Armenia, that we were almost independent at one point, or fighting off the Turks and the Iranians and the Safavids. So, but it did fail, or in a sense that they weren't successful in creating an independent Armenia. But I believe they were still, some of these leaders, some of these lords still retained some sort of autonomy, or were they completely put under the Khanats at this point?
So, 1722, 1728 is a battle. By 1736, Safavids have completely collapsed, and they're the Afshars who are taking over Iran, another Turkic tribe, Shia at this point. So not really related to the Ottomans.
They're like Iranified Turkic tribes. I don't know, right?
In a sense, they were part of the Iranian institution. They were Turkic tribes, but they worked for the Iranian state.
Yeah.
And eventually Nadir Shah came onto the scene, and he helped establish these Khanats or Khanates. Khan being a Mongolian term for like Khan, like Genghis Khan.
Yeah, Lord, King, whatever you want to call it. So like these lordships, Khanats, and what were the names? Because we hear the Azeri people always mention the Erevan Khanat, the Karabakh Khanat. Was it a Zangezur Khanat?
No, so Syunik or Zangezur, as you mentioned, which we'll get to that term eventually.
Yeah.
Syunik and Artsakh were both part of the Karabakh Khanat.
Got it.
While modern day Armenia, most of northern part, so let's say Armavir, Arakadzotan, Geghargunik, Kotaik, and Ararat and Yerevan were part of the Yerevan or Irevan Khanate, and then Nakhichevan Khanate included Nakhichevan, but also Vayotszur.
Okay. So this, I don't remember if we mentioned it in the last Artsakh episode, but when these Khanats existed, were these Meliks still semi-independent at this point, or were they stripped of their
So privileges? No, the Meliks were still there. The Meliks held their power until the Russians came, and the Russians are the ones who
disbanded.
They abolished all noble titles for any non-Eastern Orthodox groups.
Muslims and Armenians
gone. But they were smart enough to employ these Armenian Meliks into the army.
Yeah, they did.
And many of them became generals.
Yeah.
Even before the Russians came to the region, Armenians from Artsakh and Syunik were already fighting for the Russian cause, which is also, went hand in hand with the Armenian cause to liberate, Eastern Armenia from Iranian rule. And that kind of worked out.
Well, in our first episode, in our Artsakh episode, we were kind of talking about what Karabakh means. It's a Persian Turkic hybrid
Combo.
word, yeah. And they keep, so in the news today, when you're listening about Syunik, you'll hear Azerbaijan mention the Zangezur corridor. They're trying to create this corridor between Nakhichevan and mainland Azerbaijan, let's say, that split between Syunik, which is why Syunik is such a vital and geographically important place for Armenia today. One, because it connects us to Iran, where our 80% of our borders are blockaded right now by Turkey and Azerbaijan. That border with Iran is a lifeline. And this idea of pan-Turkism, which we've also mentioned in an earlier episode, though really geographically one of the main things that's splitting up, let's say, Central Asia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey is Syunik.
Yeah.
It's this physical barrier between the two. And so that's what they're hoping to get out of it, is a connection between, they want the Zangezur corridor. I thought Zangezur was a Turkic word, but you were telling me different, huh?
It's not. It's actually an Armenian word. It's from Khachadour.
Yeah.
So
What does that mean?
I'm not sure what Zak means, but we have it in written text, and Zor obviously means valley. So valley of Zak.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the area where modern day Der is. So right before you enter the Artsakh border, so kind of east of Goris. So it's from there down to the Aghavno and Vorodan River confluence, which is near what we call Khashunik or Gubatla in Azerbaijani. So that area was called Zakedzor, and eventually became Zangezur,
Yeah.
which is now what the Azeris use. But again, Armenian origin.
Nakhichevan is of Armenian origin. Zangezur is of Armenian origin. Yeah, Erivan is of Armenian origin. So at this point, and I want to talk a little bit about the populations. We mentioned how there was those Akkoyunlu and Karakoyunlu, these Turkic tribes. There was the Mongols that came. There was the Iranians, and then you're saying this last Iranian empire was the Afshars, who were of Turkic origin, let's say. What was the demographics of Syunik like the 1800s, let's say, before we come into the modern era?
So, 1700s, we don't really know too much, but we do know that the Karabakh Khanate, which included Syunik or Zangezur, Artsakh, mountainous Karabakh, and then lowland Karabakh, where you have Aghdam, Berda or Partav, historic Armenian.
Yeah.
The lowlands were more populated by these nomadic Azeri herd,
Turkic,
proto-Azeri. Yeah, they would be the ancestors of modern-day Azerbaijanis. There were these Turkic tribes who were brought in the region by the Safavids to establish their hold on the region. They were Shia Muslims, so it was in their benefit.
Right. Put them in power in those
Yeah.
areas and stuff. And they were semi-nomadic, so they would actually like go up the mountain, come down the
Exactly.
mountain, but they were like inhabiting more
The
towards
lowlands.
the bottom of the mountains.
So near the Kura River.
Yeah.
But again, they would go up the mountains of Lerna and Artsakh or mountainous Artsakh. They were not too deeply settled in Syunik. The biggest group, if anything, non-Armenian group, would be Kurds. These Kurds, again, were not native to the region. These Kurds were initially brought in the late 16th century. And then more came in the 18th century under Safavid rule. They were Shia Turks, Shia Kurds, which is rare because most Kurds are Sunni. But these Shia Kurds were brought into the region, and they were kind of like how would you phrase this? Like a block between the Syunik Meliks and the Artsakh Meliks.
Oh, they put them in between. And is that what they call Red Kurdistan? Is that what we're talking about?
Soviet-era Red Kurdistan.
Right.
So the first demographic census we have of the region is from 1886. And the Zangezur district of the Elizabethpol province of the Russian Empire was home to about 124,000 people.
Okay.
57,000 or 46% were ethnic Armenians. 30% or 38,000 were then called Tatars, modern-day Azerbaijanis. 22% were Kurds, and then 1% were actually Persians.
The Tats, right?
Tats, yeah, or Tati.
Well, when I've seen, and Tats also lived throughout, let's say, Azerbaijan today. Baku was like a lot of Tat people lived there. But so the Tats are like Iranian, more Persian people. And I remember looking at a map of the demographics of Syunik, and I remember seeing like a few blobs of Tats living over there too. What happened to them? Did they disappear?
They physically did not disappear, but as a cultural group, they disappeared because
Assimilated?
by force. The Soviets in the 1920s, 1930s basically looked at any Iranian-speaking Shia Muslim group in the South Caucasus and were like, oh,
Called them Azerbaijani.
you are now Azerbaijani. So that includes the Kurds who lived between Syunik and Artsakh. So the areas of Lachin or Berdzor and Karvajar, Kalbajar, and even Gubatla, was mentioned, Khachadour, were majority Kurdish.
Yeah.
And were completely Azerbaijanized, and some were even expelled to Kazakhstan in 1937.
Right.
So Kazakhstan actually has 60,000 of these Kurds
Red Kurdistan.
who were pushed out of this so-called Red Kurdistan district between Artsakh and Armenia proper.
Well, even the Talish and Lezgins, these are other minorities in Azerbaijan.
The Talish were reclassified. The Lezgins were not. The Talish were the Talish, Tats, and Kurds. So Iranian-speaking groups
Yeah.
who were more closely tied to the Azerbaijanis. They lived in similar habitats,
Okay.
similar areas of cohabitation. Lezgins were more in the north.
Yeah, right. They're
So
more North Caucasians.
more
yeah.
distinct culture.
They're closer to the Caucasian Albanians, which we mentioned in the last episode.
Yeah.
So, to paint a picture, we're in the 1800s. Armenian noble families kind of still exist, but not to the same extent that they were before the Russian rule, before maybe the last Iranian rule. And there's a mixed population of people, whether that's in Syunik or Artsakh or different parts of eastern Armenia. But still a majority Armenian population. I'd say 40% is a pretty large percentage.
I mean, 46% in the
nearly
Zangezur
50.
district. Shushi district was over 50%.
Yeah.
Again, Armenians, even if they were, let's say, a minority, they were still a plurality in most regions of eastern historic Armenia.
Yeah. Always a large portion there.
And if you look at the Zangezur district, as we mentioned, it was split in half in 1920 between Red Kurdistan and Syunik as we know it. So the portion that was given to Armenia as modern-day Syunik was 60% Armenian. And then the Red Kurdistan district was about 8% Armenian.
Okay.
So Western Zangezur was very overwhelmingly Armenian. Eastern Zangezur was mostly Kurdish, and then some Tatars, Azeris, and then some Armenians. But a lot of these Armenians were actually wiped out during the 1905-1907 Armenian Tatar
I was just
massacres.
about to ask you about that, actually. Like, was that... I know it happened in Nakhichevan, it happened in Artsakh, and so Syunik was also affected during these Armeno-Tatar wars.
Yeah. There was one village called Zeva, which was one of the last Armenian villages left in the area where the Kurds had settled, so between Artsakh proper and Syunik, completely razed to the ground. I mean, because if you look at the area today, I mean, there are dozens of Armenian churches and monasteries and fortresses and the homes of former meliks.
Right. In those quote-unquote occupied territories.
Yeah,
the
so what would be Khachadour, province of Artsakh, corresponding to Lachin, Gubatla, and Zengilan, those three districts, Khachadour as we call it, they are littered with Armenian monuments.
Yeah. And I always tell this to people, is just because you're a minority doesn't negate the fact that it's not your homeland, you know? Like,
I mean, Native Americans.
That's what I was going to say. It's like, what majority city in America is Native American, but it's, you know, you still say that this is their homeland, you know, this is their land. Well, so that this with Armeno-Tatar War in 1905 did affect, like, there was ethnic cleansing at that point. And so World War I happens, the genocide happens, the First Armenian Republic happens, and this region was claimed by both sides, I guess.
Claimed and fought over by both sides.
Yeah, Artsakh, Nakhichevan, and Syunik were fought between the Tatar population and the Armenian population. But you know, we still had claim on it, let's say. And in 1920, the Bolsheviks are coming down into Armenia. They're trying to take it over. And at one point, we have a rebellion. We kick the Bolsheviks out for a hot minute, but they come back obviously with a bigger army.
Yeah.
And maybe you could tell the story better than I can. But Garigi Nujde, one of those figures from that era, that was one of our main freedom fighters, in an effort to fight off the Bolsheviks, kept fighting them up until, you know, they went back to where David Bek was, up in those mountains in Syunik, fighting in those mountains, and actually created a temporary, or like very short term, but it was called the Mountainous Republic of Armenia.
Republic of Mountainous Armenia. I mean, it's complicated because, as you mentioned, Syunik, Artsakh, and Nakhichevan were these disputed territories between Armenia and Azerbaijan, who both claimed them. Nakhichevan was at times under Armenian control, but
Switched over.
not even to Azerbaijan though.
Ottomans.
The Ottomans, exactly. It was the Ottomans who held sway in Nakhchivan because, I mean, the Azerbaijani government couldn't really access the region because Syunik was almost always under Armenian control. Artsakh, on the other hand, weird situation where there was a British installed government led by Khosrov Bek Sultanov, who was a Turkified Kurd from the region. So officially this like Azerbaijani associated administration, but de facto Armenians on the ground were ruling the land in Artsakh and mountainous Karabakh.
But didn't the British like agree that, okay, we're going to divide these countries based on the Russian provinces, right?
Yeah, that was a problem and no one liked because the Aussies were like, no, we want Nakhchivan. Armenians were like, no,
we want Artsakh and Syunik.
And Artsakh, yeah.
Exactly. And so that's why so the Bolsheviks came, and I think that's what they were agreeing on making.
So the Bolsheviks, when they came, they took Azerbaijan first. So they took Artsakh, and they're like, "Hey, we'll kind of get back to this. Like, put on hold. Put on hold for a sec." And then they're like, Syunik. And then so initially the Soviets were like, "You know what? We're gonna give Artsakh, Syunik, and Nakhchivan all to Armenia from Azerbaijan as a sign of brotherhood of Soviet states and Soviet peoples." No, it didn't happen. Nakhchivan was obviously given an autonomous republic status after its Armenian population was wiped out in 3 different massacres in 1918, 1919, and 1920. Artsakh was given later on that semi-autonomous status within Azerbaijan. Syunik was given to Armenia, the western parts of it, at least of Zangezur district. The eastern parts were made into Red Kurdistan. But it was the Bolsheviks who were really playing games. And as I mentioned, Gariki Nezhde and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation launched the February uprising, Pedrevaryan Abuzlan, February 1921, so 2 months after Armenia was Sovietized. And really, they took back Yerevan, Abovyan, much of Armenia.
Yeah, they kicked them out.
Yeah, they're like, bye.
Yeah.
And the Soviets were like, oh, you can't do that. So they came back, and Gariki Nezhde was like, you know what? Up to the mountains we go, which is how Armenians usually do it. We nestle in and hunker down and
guerrilla
take
warfare,
up arms.
And but there wasn't the issue like the deal is like after fighting and actually holding off the Bolsheviks for a long time, they couldn't actually beat us in Syunik. But I think we were getting weak or getting tired, and the agreement is like, hey, Gariki Nezhde and you rebellion dudes, if you leave, we'll give Syunik to Armenia, and it's because. Again, it was that they're trying to make the countries based on the earlier provinces, right? So it was
the Bolsheviks not so much because they clearly gave Nakhchivan to Azerbaijan. But Gariki Nezhde's whole thing was, I want to make sure fully that Syunik will be a part of Armenia.
Right. And so that was the deal. Is like, we'll leave if you make this part of Armenia. And so that is why, for the most part, Syunik was part of the Armenian SSR and is part of Armenia today.
That's one promise the Soviets kept.
Yeah, the very
one
last
and only
one. Yeah.
But yeah, Nezhde and his followers actually went to Tabriz.
Yeah, they went south. They went into Iran. They escaped through there.
And then obviously other activities later in the future.
Well, so Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic has Syunik there, and so today with Azerbaijan, we're trying to figure out this border with them, right? This is what the whole most of the issue is today. Is this border has never really been solid. It's even the borders that we had during the Soviet Union were like economic borders. They weren't military borders. Also,
as mentioned, economic borders. So the way the Soviets drew the borders were to align with herding pastures and water rights and this and that. So if you look at Syunik, as we mentioned, most of the Zangezur district was given to Armenia in 1921. And then you had little bits chipped off here and there.
I've noticed that because the map changes over
so if you look from 1922 to 1936, the areas that are now under Azerbaijani control, which they were formerly Red Kurdistan, a lot of these districts, so north of Goris, those pashlands around Arnavuz, which Armenians and Aussies are kind of going back and forth over, or even these lakes, it's not Sevlich, it's another lake.
That area. A waterway.
It's called Al-Lich.
Oh.
It's this little inlet between Gerargunik and Syunik. It's like a knife into Armenia's eastern border. If you've probably seen it.
Yeah.
That area was handed over to Azerbaijan because the waters from there mostly flowed into Karvajar or Kalbajar. It's like, benefit them. And then the land east of Kapan, which Armenians were forced to give up as of the November 9th agreement, those areas which were the eastern, I mean, you can see it. I mean, now the Aussies have a clear view of Kapan, its airport. The entire city is open. So those territories were initially part of
The Armenian
Soviet
SSR.
Armenia, yeah. And were forcibly given up by 1936.
They chipped away little bit by little bit.
And it was only there. I mean, the Azerbaijanis were then given this enclave called Kyarki or Dikranashen
right.
in Ararat province, so just north of Nakhichevan. And then more bits taken out from the northeast in Tavush region. So they gave away lands in Voskepar.
They really made a mess.
The problem was that the Soviets built the highways through these lands. So the highway from Yerevan to Syunik ran through this Azerbaijani enclave, Soviet Azerbaijani enclave, if you will. And then the other road in the north from Yerevan to Tiflis or Tbilisi ran through the northern Azerbaijani enclave in Voskepar or Askipara, as they call it. So, I mean, just problems upon problems that the Soviets made for us with their weird borders that we didn't even agree to. I mean, we were forced to
we had no
comply
say
with them.
in that.
Moscow was like, this looks good.
And which is why we have these, and which is why I would always argue that these borders are just problematic, right? We need new borders, Ben.
I mean, the fact that we're trying to go back to Soviet-era borders, it's like we're going back to borders drawn by dictator Stalin.
Yeah, dictator Stalin that, was either purposely made so complicated to where it would create these problems in the future, or borders that they assumed wouldn't, require, division again because they're all part of this big Soviet Union, So, and these waterways, it's an interesting point you bring up. And this recent war, like my friend, one of my buddies, Nari Kuyumjan, just recently did a study on this where he's kind of showing how a lot of the reasoning or the motivation for taking those regions, taking Artsakh, is because a lot of the water that comes from there goes into the Kura and the Araks rivers, which feeds into Azerbaijan. Same thing with Syunik. And so controlling the water resources of the region was part of the motivation that encouraged them to to be so aggressive with trying to take as much as they can. And with what we're seeing today, I mean, is it a coincidence that they're trying to take control of Sevlich, let's say, these new waterways here? So that's also a theme that we're seeing, and I think everyone should be keeping an eye out on that.
I mean, the problem is with that is it's a global issue. Water is an issue all around the world.
Water wars it's going to be a thing
exactly.
in the future, yeah.
I mean, Turkey is using it as a weapon against the Syrians and Iraqis by blocking off the Euphrates and Tigris.
And they're damming up the entire Araks and the Kura that goes into
in the Turkish side, yeah. So blocking off water to Iran, Armenia, and Georgia and Azerbaijan, all of them.
And what's interesting is Azerbaijan is the most vulnerable out of all of them because they're the end of it all. So it'll affect Armenia and the Ararat Valley and Georgia, but it'll affect mostly Azerbaijan, and I really see this as almost an opportunity to create a wedge between these two countries. They never politicize this issue. If you notice, they'll politicize other water resource issues, but not the one between Azerbaijan and Turkey. But so there are many reasons why Syunik is a geographically, strategically, politically, militarily an important place to have. It's a lifeline to Armenia.
Also mines. I mean, areas rich in minerals.
You're right. I mean, even on the other side of the border now, in that Red Kurdistan you're talking about, there's all these gold mines that the Azerbaijan's creating contracts with the European companies to go and mine up now. So there's a lot of mines in the south of Armenia as well. So the Soviet Union broke up and we adopted the borders of those regions, and the rest is history. We know the Artsakh War happened. We know what happened in November, and today we're seeing these issues along the Syunik border. And I'd like to stress to everybody how important this part of Armenia is and how rich it is in our ancient Armenian history and contemporary Armenian history. So, Chris, thank you again for doing this with us. I hope we'll do more of these. And if you guys notice, we'll be a lot of these things overlap throughout the episode. So thank you again, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So yeah, definitely read up on Syunik, everyone.
Hell yeah. You have been listening to Haituk Talks, the official podcast of the AWIFE West. I'm Haig Minasian, and we're just a couple of Armenians talking in the world.
A couple of Armenians talking in the world.